It's time to get real with Lady Ray. Real talk, real conversation. Real people, real answers. Real talk, real conversation. So let's get real with Lady Ray.
Mrs. Firdoze Bulbulia. Welcome to the show and thank you so much for taking the time out to have this conversation with me.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So before we get into the actual purpose of why I've got you on the show, tell me your passion for children in broadcasting. Where does that stem from?
So I think my passion is really around activism. As a young person, I was a student activist and I was detained as a matric student. So I actually went to prison fighting against the apartheid government. So as a student activist, that's where the activism started. So my passion really started through the activism. As a student activist in 1980, in fact, I was in matric and I was detained during the school boycott. So as you would know, the big boycott was in 1976 with the uprisings that took place in particularly Black African schools. And then in 1980, there were the boycotts that took place in colored, so-called colored and Indian schools. So as a leader in a school in Lenasia at Trinity High School, that was really where my activism started. And so I was amongst one of the few young females in particular to be detained. And I spent time at John Vorster Square, which is in Johannesburg. And so I think that activism stayed with me. And then in 1993, I was involved with the National Children's Rights Committee. Now, the NCRC came into being because we were preparing for the democracy. This is 1993, and the focus was on children's rights. And basically, the NCRC worked in South Africa as an interim organization to get the Children's Charter sorted out. And UNICEF, which, as you know, is the UN organization that is responsible for children, UNICEF would not work in South Africa because of apartheid. So the NCRC was that interim body that really ensured that children's rights were on the table, and that as we were preparing for a new South Africa and a new democracy, we needed to talk around children's rights. And so I got involved in all of the rights movements that took place. And the NCRC became a very important organization for me, particularly to work with children and youth issues. If you remember, at the time, Nelson Mandela, who was released, and as they were preparing for the elections, there was even the conversation as to whether 16-year-olds should be given the vote.
Yes.
Because basically what the leadership was saying was that if these young people change the course of the history of our country through boycotts, shouldn't they then be part of that political change in the country? Of course, you know that eventually you had to be 18 in order to vote. But that conversation was a very important one.
So before we started the conversation, I made a statement that social media has become, or may have become, the new babysitter. There's a statement that goes, your parents may forget your birthday, but Mark Zuckerberg won't. In your opinion, do you think that social media has become the babysitter of this era?
I think it's a very difficult conversation because everything deals with data. So who has the data? The people who have the data are the people who might be on social media. I think we have a very skewed vision in terms of where we sit in the LSM in which we sit. And so we think that, everybody else around us have the same access, but they don't. People who do have data, and if they have a telephone, they are using it for something more important, I hope. For those who can be, and you know that some of the communications, the telcos are actually offering almost free data or allowing you to browse or to be on social media as part of a package that is cheap enough so that they can draw you in. But our research shows that, in fact, it's not really all the children who have the ability to be on social media. I think that what is interesting is Twitter, in terms of Black Twitter, and the amount of people who are in those Twitter streets, as they say, and the way in which people respond and in the way in which they participate, almost as if that is a separate persona to who they are. I'm not quite sure about it becoming a babysitter. I think that television for a very long time has been a babysitter, and that will still continue. So children would probably most of the time be watching television rather than maybe producing TikTok videos. Although I think that just this week, there has been a concern around the age restriction for TikTok, because children are getting exposed, children are being drawn in, children, there is, in terms of not an adult supervision, I think that is the concern, because parents do give, if they can and they can afford it, give the child, either an iPad, so it's a tablet, or a smartphone, and, keep the child occupied. So you could be in a restaurant and you'll see all these little kids, on their mobile devices. But as I say, it's very skewed in the politics of South Africa, because the haves are the ones who will have these devices. The bulk of our country, the younger children, do not indeed, in fact, have the device.
Okay, so there's a lot of times we see children being abused and being abducted because of their access. So now we're talking more to the haves. Do you think that sometimes parents and caregivers are being absolved of the role that they play? Because when the child gets kidnapped or gets abused online, um, they run to the police station, they make cases, and it's all about the perpetrator. Yet they are giving their children access. And they're saying, my child was born to be a star. I can't hamper my child's creativity. So are parents being absolved of a responsibility that they have in exposing their children to this platform?
I don't think parents can ever be absolved of their responsibility of being a parent. Your responsibility is to take care of your children. Whether you have a babysitter, whether you have a mobile phone, whether you have a creche or a school, your responsibility, your child is your responsibility. What people are doing, of course, is then pushing the blame somewhere else. And I think that the telcos, I think that the social media have a responsibility to children as well. And so as the Children and Broadcasting Foundation for Africa, our work is ensuring that we communicate what should and should not be taking place in the space. So for example, the telcos in the beginning were too afraid to advertise to children. They knew that their responsibilities were bigger than their budgets and their bottom line and their profits. I think, unfortunately, there is a shift. And I think that parents have, it's all this influencers. I want to be an influencer. And they don't even know what that means.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if people have seen the Netflix show that deconstructs what it means to be an influencer. And the fact that indeed you can even buy votes, you can buy likes, you can buy people, followers. So I was, in fact, just yesterday on Twitter, just, whenever I follow a story, I go back to see who's posted it, and I check to see, how many followers they have. So you begin to understand, who's the audience? Who are you playing this to? When you make this point, who are you hoping would read it? But when you are in the business of over 10,000 followers, so I'm not even talking about the people who are in the millions, are you really considering who's reading your text? And I come back to, when we were drawing up the South African, in fact, the Africa Charter on Children's Broadcasting, part of what we were saying to broadcasters internationally is that the content you produce in your country will be shown in my country. So the issues that are important to your children will become issues for our children. So when you do this, you have a responsibility to know your audience and your future audience. And I don't think that there's enough education, media literacy around what this means. So I think that, yes, parents are not taking responsibility. If you look at just recently, this little girl who was bullied online, she was being filmed as she was being bullied, and then she committed suicide. Whose responsibility is that? Because even the child who is doing the bullying, she's playing to the camera. So it's all about the hype around what we create as soon as you switch a camera on, you are already changing your persona.
Yeah.
And I always say this to people in a simple way. If you take a profile pic, if you take your own selfie, you're going to look for the best angle. There's always this joke. I don't know if you saw Trevor Noah say, people are taking, different points and pointing the camera in different spaces. And then they go, oh, just a quiet day at the office, or just, just a pic that I just took. No, everything that we do is curated. You and I sitting here today is curated. How I place my camera, how I frame my shot, how I look to be presentable, who is my audience, all of that is created and curated either by me or you or our producers. So the sad thing with children is that they don't have that ability yet. And so they take the camera and they begin to tell a story, or they begin to, react or respond to something without much thought. And that is a big problem. And parents do not have media literacy either. So they also don't know what to do.
So you mentioned as to how broadcasting is governed. How children are protected in terms of broadcasting. How are children protected when it comes to social media? Or are they protected in any way?
I don't think children are protected in social media. I don't think there is enough media literacy for the adults, never mind the children. So I think that we have a responsibility as people working in the media to continuously hold responsible those who own social media and those who produce it. So parents need more education. They need to understand their roles and their responsibilities, but so do the telcos and the broadcasters and the influencers in particular. I'm watching this little girl, AKA's daughter, who I think now has 1 million followers on Instagram. I understand that her grandmother was a teacher, and her grandmother also has many followers. And I think there is something to be said as we deconstruct, and I'm using this purely as an example, as we deconstruct how we put the child in that space. Now, there was a time when we had child actors, and many of the child actors in Hollywood, in fact, by the time they became teenagers or just older, suffered huge problems of depression, of abuse, of addiction, because they were not properly prepared for that role, for that attention, for that media hype. Now you have this little girl whom I, because of my work as the chairperson of the Children and Broadcasting Foundation for Africa, I go online and I watch what these kids are doing, and I wonder whether that grandmother who is pushing for this little girl to become this number one, whatever, because the way that all of her clips are curated by the grandmother, it's the pretty doll, or it is, the pony rides. And all of this is advertising, sponsorship, capitalism. Now, it might be wonderful now because you're getting, invited to freebies around, sponsorships galore. But what is happening to your mental health? And I'm sorry to use this example, but AKA's girlfriend, who just passed away, So was she pushed? Did she commit suicide? What was her mental state? What is the mental health? Now, using this little example of one family begins to make you understand that your child at home who is pushing to be a star, and you as the parent thinking, well, let me open the space, you need to do some more research.
Yes.
And when we started in the space of social media, and particularly in the YouTube world, especially with youngsters, I was running some workshops in Doha through the Film Institute, the Doha Film Institute, and I brought in about 100 media professionals working in children's media. And they were talking about all these influences. And whilst we were having the conference, there were several influencers who either became depressed, who committed suicide, who really just, it was overwhelming. Now, nobody talks about that side of the story.
Now
We
that
know about the ones who are the big cases.
Now that's the purpose as to why I decided to have this conversation, because we just tend to highlight the upside of being an influencer and being a child on social media. And I want to get back, not to stray from where you're going, but I want to get back to the example that you used of AKA's daughter. And one of the things that I've noticed also browsing through social media is there's a lot of between 9 and 11-year-old girls who have makeup channels, who have watch my nighttime skincare routine. And then the parents are posting pictures of daddy's little princess, mommy's little princess. This poor child must be so confused in her mind. Okay, so am I a woman when I get onto my YouTube channel? And then I'm a girl when the camera gets switched off? Are parents treating their children as cash cows? Because, like you mentioned, and that is the thing, what is the responsibility of a parent in terms of, do they say, okay, there is a time, there is a space where this can be done? What are the guidelines that parents should be putting in place before they find 11-year-old girls acting like older women, not just on YouTube, when it becomes their reality?
You raise a few very important questions. The one around guidelines, as the CBFA, the Children and Broadcasting Foundation for Africa, there are guidelines even in terms of child actors. So at one stage, I recall when we started, so the CBFA, we started in 1993, 94. By 95, we became the Children's Broadcasting Foundation for Africa. In the period just before that, we were a lobby group. And at that point, at that time, there were all these child actors on shows at the SABC, and when we'd go in to talk to them and try to talk to the parents, there were youngsters who were saying to me, I don't want to go to school anymore. I'm earning more than my mother. I'm earning more than my parents. Why should I go to school?
Yes.
And the parents were also pushing it because, of course, if the child is earning almost double what they are earning, this becomes, in some cases, yes, they need the money. But in most cases, it is about an independence that you're giving to the children, which they are, again, not ready for. Now the child thinks, okay, I'm just going to become an actor and I don't need to learn. So we would have to tell them, you have to go to school. Your education is more important. You need to learn and to read and write. Because what happens if after all of that, what you lose your job, you're not acting anymore, the series is over. People don't understand that. And then you have the same issues when it comes now to social media, which is even worse, because at least as an actor in a children's program, you had other adults who were working in that space who hopefully were more educated and media literate. Now you're sitting in your bedroom or in your space wherever at home, and you are creating your own channel. And there's no supervision, there's no media literacy, there's no adult saying to you what you can and cannot do, how you should be behaving, what is allowed. One of the things that we also do around research in children's television and in characters of children, the little Barbie doll, for example, let's just use Barbie. How many children wish that they were Barbie?
Mhm.
And how irresponsible and ridiculous was that? Especially look at South Africa, a country that is predominantly Black. No child is going to be a Barbie doll. So then we had if you remember, there was Dora the Explorer.
Yes.
And Dora was this chubby little Latin American girl with big brown eyes, and she was so cute, and she was learning all these lovely things. And then suddenly we saw, oh, Dora was getting a little bit thinner. Her waistline was coming in. The eyes were popping up differently. The body gestures were something else. And we were going, this is an over sexualization of the girl child. We don't want this. So you go to Woolworths and you can't find shorts and a t-shirt for girls because you're finding pink ballerina costumes and little bras and little, shoes. And the next thing you're finding high heels everywhere. And children are breaking their ankles and falling off, and hurting themselves. But nobody is prepared to discuss this.
Yeah.
And all we're doing as parents is we perpetuate it. So, oh, well, next door neighbor's child has it. My child should have it. And there is no conversation, no informed conversation about what is going to happen to your child. And you are right that the child then begins to also over-sexualize and begins to start being more adult-like. The barriers and the parameters and the spaces between what is allowed as a child and what is allowed as an adult begin to blur. The way that parents interact with their children begins to blur. And before you know it, you've lost control.
Yeah.
And, we are not saying that control in a bad way. We're talking about how do you protect, support, inform, educate that child who is really your precious gift, and that you should be helping to become a good adult and a good citizen, not to become an influencer, not to become, a superstar, because most of the superstars, unfortunately, are struggling. And mental health has become a huge problem and a huge concern. So we as adults, as parents, as media professionals, have a huge responsibility to communicate these pitfalls in the industry.
So thank you for that. There is this perception that social media has become the grounds that is used, or the new platform that is used to find new talent. That's where everybody goes to discover new singers, new models, the next face of. Um, and that's where parents have, for lack of a better phrase, parents are selling their children on these platforms. And little girls and little boys and teenagers are marketing themselves because they want to become the next Justin Bieber, because that's where he was discovered. And we keep hearing the stories of, I was discovered on my Instagram post. Or so how do children become the next big thing, and how do parents who believe that their children are born to be stars attain this without sacrificing their children to the woes of social media?
My advice would be allow your child to finish their high school. Let them go into whatever vocation they want. And if it's going to be a vocation in our industry, then let them get the best education around that. So you go to film school, or you go to an art school, or you study the arts. And that is really where you get the foundation. And you might begin to say, actually, I don't want to be in front of the camera. I want to be behind the camera. I want to be the storyteller. I want to be the writer. I want to be the producer. I want to be the editor. There are so many aspects of this industry besides being in front of the camera. And I think that parents need to understand it. Now, I'm obviously much older than you. I come from an Indian Muslim background. In my growing up, going into this kind of world was a taboo. How can you wouldn't even consider it. So for us, the fight was not about wanting to be an influencer in the way of my face is on show. I wanted to influence the way that people thought and deconstructed this vocation, that they've begun to see that storytelling is an important part, is an essential part of the work that we do. And that is where I need to locate what it is that I'm doing. And if we can begin to do that with our children, with the young people, even the influencers, you know, as you say this, Ray, I think the thing is probably to begin, we have quite a bit of outreach, but I think is to begin the outreach now on what it means to be an influencer. Yeah. What it means when you look at Anele and she has, I don't know, several million followers. What pressure does that put on her to wake up every day, to look in a particular way, to post, to continuously post, to continuously put this camera in your face? It's not a healthy way to live. It's not the way that life ought to be. We are not meant to be on the spotlight all the time. Now, that is what you need to explain. And so if I come back to this little child, AKA's daughter, you know, her life is out there. That's her father, DJ Zinkler is the mother, that's the grandmother. So this whole world, there's no privacy. There's nothing that is sacred. There is nothing that is special because it is about, come on, get the camera out. When Instagram just started, people were like, come, take the picture. My food's getting cold. You know, it became a joke. My food's getting cold. I've got to put this out. Now, as a media professional, of course, I'm engaged in social media. Of course, I post. And sometimes some of my friends, so these are not colleagues who do not, you know, not people who are media literate, who would say, wow, you've posted so much, or wow, there's so, and I have to say to them, that is a separate persona to who I am. I am posting my work. I'm posting space, you know, information within that space. So do not confuse the two. What happens, unfortunately, is that we blur that. And so this little child is the Instagram baby, is not the child at home who really, quite frankly, comes from a family that is dislocated, that needs support, that probably herself needs a lot of love and care. And hopefully that is happening anyway, besides what we see in terms of the image. But it would be a very good case study to extract the child out of that space and say, how do you feel? Yeah. How does it feel every day that you're on show? And I bring this to maybe not so much a related situation, but yesterday I was on a webinar from the University of Johannesburg, and they were discussing queer identities and the issue around people being born with both sexual organs, male and female. And the one child was saying in particular, you know, when I think she started having abdominal pain, and when they checked it out, they obviously discovered that there was, you know, another organ, and that either she needed an op, because you have to decide which gender you want to be, or in her case, because she didn't want to have the op, they had to look for another doctor. And she says she had to go to Baragwanath Hospital every Saturday, at which point the doctor put her on show for all his student doctors and said, oh, you see, so this is what happens. And showing how, you know, the sexual organs, both male and female, were in this child. So it's that kind of, it's a much more crude and deeper, more profound example that I'm giving you. But isn't that what we're doing? Yes. When you're busy on social media, busy being an influencer, putting yourself out there for people to question, to ridicule, to support, to not support, all of this hampers the child. It's a really difficult thing. And part of our research shows that, you know, some kids, they put out a post and they need to get a like. And if there's no like, they get depressed and they're like, nobody likes me. And you've got to say, but that's not your friends.
I think that's the thing. For me, that is also, because even as an adult, when you put something out, there is an expectation that there will be a response. And as adults, we've grown to expect disappointment. But as children, we were raised that my mom will always say, I like it, or your picture is pretty, or even if you put two different color socks on, your mom will say, oh, that looks so pretty. Um, so they live in a safe environment of acceptance. And social media is far from that. Social media is cruel and unkind because when you open yourself up to social media, you have opened yourself up to rejection. And by making that statement, it raises the question, do you think that there is an appropriate age at which children should be allowed to have exposure to social media?
Absolutely. So, as you started off with Mark Zuckerberg, I think part of the history is that many of these people who work in the social media space don't, in fact, allow their children to be involved in that space. They have put in protection for their children. Now, it's really like the person who, as you know, with the DOP system, the alcoholism that's in so much in some of the communities where it is being sold, or drugs, you're not going to give it to your child, but let the other kids have it, let their parents deal with it. This is not my issue. So I would say that unless children are media literate, and unfortunately, we do not teach media literacy in our schools as we should. This is something else that as the CBFA, we have been fighting and really cajoling and trying to get, the government, important, whoever the people are, whether it's the National Film and Video Foundation, the film commissions, the Department of Education. Media literacy is as important as numeracy, as arithmetic, as mathematics. You need to understand it because it is the most, at the moment, it's what every child in any society is being exposed to.
Can I just pause you there and ask you, do you just want to unpack for us? When you say media literacy, what do you mean?
So I think, in the old days, they used to say to us, you need to read between the lines. And people said, what exactly does that mean? Or when people would say, oh, I read it in the newspaper, it has to be true. Or I saw it on television, it has to be true. And today we learn there's fake news. And we know that we can create a story in whichever position we need to take. So when I talk about media literacy, I'm talking about young people being given the tools to deconstruct, to break down the media, whether it's radio, whether it's television, whether it's print media, and now social media. So when you read something or when you see something, break it down. You say, I'm looking at you right now, Ray, sitting in this lovely frame. I see Real with Lady Ray. I see you seated as you are. I watch how you are dressed. I see how you interact with me. I look at the background and the foreground. How are you framed? What does that say about you? What are you hoping to achieve? Now, I could have a similar setup, exactly the same backdrop, exactly the same look, and have a different person sitting there who could be dressed differently. Maybe, I want to say less appropriately, but that depends on what you identify as appropriate. So would you be wearing your gown, your clothing to go to bed? Would you be wearing your Sunday dress? Would you be wearing a swimming costume? Would you be wearing your underwear? What would you be wearing as you are framed in front of this conversation that we're having? So you start to deconstruct for your reader, your listener, your audience, what that means. What are they reading in that frame? The same thing with a sentence. So you're reading about, we were all, I don't know about you, but I was so glued to what was happening with the George Floyd case. And, everybody said the George Floyd murder case. And somebody said, it's not George Floyd who's on trial. It's the other guy. Get it right. Yes. So in terms of that, Chauvin, It's the Chauvin murder trial. He committed the murder. George died. So it's how do we phrase that sentence? How do we say it? And then when the word guilty came out, it was guilty, guilty, guilty. What does that mean? And what goes beyond guilty? Where does this person go to? So when you read a headline, and headlines are really sensationalized, it's to attract your attention, it's to get you to read the article. And as they say, once I've got your attention, you're now going to hopefully continue reading. What happens in social media, if you have 74 characters in which to tell a story, you're not giving a full story. You cannot give a full story. So with Twitter, it's about getting those bites out quickly, So what of that sentence, what of that event are you going to put out? So when you talk about media literacy and you're doing workshops with young people, I like to start off with, and I do this across the board, we've trained globally. So whether I'm talking to a group of journalists in Western Europe or in North Africa, I would say a simple thing like just write one word that describes Africa. One word. And you'll get words like poverty, dark continent, and even Africans. And then you say to them, but what about the waterfalls? What about the game? What about the mountains? And then they're like, oh, yes. And then you shift and you say, well, write one positive sentence. So it's about how we deconstruct it. So when you have mass media and you have the general media telling you about this dark continent where everybody has HIV and AIDS and, are dying like flies, you begin to perpetuate that story as a story from Africa. Okay. So that's around the media literacy. How do we break it down? So now you have this little person, child, adult, whoever it might be, in that social media space. We call it Facebook, and my mother calls it brag book, because she says people only put their bragging, which is a good thing. If they were bragging, I'd be happy. But what people are saying is you never see the other angle, you never see the other side, but it's okay, because it's your photo album. And in your photo album, you are showing the wonderful things you have done. But there is another side to that story. And that's why as soon as people started coming out and talking about mental health and started saying, the before and the after, or this is, how I look, but this is actually how I look. That was a good thing, because it began to say to people, it is okay. I tested this once where, you just kind of write, oh, a lovely day, or I've been here, I've done that. And then one day I had, as you could hear, but I was trying to block the audio, I have this dry cough. And so I was like, oh, this cough is terrible. And the amount of responses that I got from family and friends and everybody giving me, different remedies and try this and try that, it was phenomenal. That, just what is it that piques somebody's attention? What is it that they're going to respond to? And we've always said a photograph is worth 1,000 words. So you put out that picture, it depends how you want to light it. If you look at my little studio right now, the pictures that I have behind me are all from Zanzibar. We hosted the Zanzibar International Film Festival in 2019. And I've been going to Zanzibar for the last 20 years. We do quite a bit of media literacy there. But that is what I brought back home into my office. So here I am sitting in Johannesburg, but my backdrop is Zanzibar. And when people see it, it's like, wow, what are those pictures? What I have curated for myself where I want to be located. And that is what I have behind me, as you have done for yourself. So when our children are busy taking pictures and then posting it, that curation, that media literacy around how that picture is framed, shot, lit, and posted, uploaded, all that is a media literacy. All that is a training. All that is something you need to learn, you need to explain, you need to deconstruct. That is the important part around media literacy.
Okay, so what I take from that is, in terms of, you mentioned towards the end of your statement, is what's behind you, what's around you. And I think a lot of times, especially with children and their innocence, a picture is just a picture. I don't realize that the street that I'm living in is in the picture, or my house number is in the picture, or something that makes me identifiable because of the school logo that's on my shirt. So the necessity for media literacy is not just so that they know how to interact and prevent themselves from being bullied, but also in terms of protecting themselves and their families. Something that a lot of times when I speak to children and you ask them, what do you want to become? They say, I want to become a TV star, or I want to be on TV. So it almost seems like social media is the vehicle that they use to get to the end goal, which is to be on TV, which is either TV or radio, which we consider to be broadcasting. So is there a coalition between broadcasting and social media, or do they just work separate of one another?
So no, they work separately. So broadcasting would be your radio and television, then you have print media, now you have social media, and we would call new media because, you know, the whole AI, so the artificial, you know, so this whole artificial intelligence, 4IR, it's all these spaces in which communication and information happen. So it's the communication and information technologies. That is the space. When you said about a child saying, oh, I want to be on TV, you know, when we grew up, we wanted to be teachers and doctors and lawyers, and, you know, we wanted to change the world. Now, everywhere I go, that's exactly what kids say. I want to be a footballer, I want to be an actress, but they don't say it. They say, I want to be Messi. I want to be, you know, the name of the actor or the performer that they like. And you begin to, that's again media literacy. Because again, you've got to say that it is in that context of, yes, I want to be a football player, but you don't need to say to me, I want to be Messi. You need to be able to say, I want to be a football player from, you know, Annandale, from Eldorado Park, from, I don't know, Fordsburg, but that in that context of where you come from, that you want to elevate it.
So a lot of times parents also have the desire for their children to be on TV or the next radio personality. What are some of the guidelines that you would give to parents for them to ensure that their children get the best experience out of being in the broadcasting industry and don't get exploited?
You know, we've always said to young people, whether they join an organization, whether you're a volunteer, wherever you might be, your voice is very important. So when you have your voice on radio or in broadcasting on TV, it is that opportunity that you can talk on behalf of your peers, on behalf of your community, on behalf of your sector. So it is an extremely important role. And with it comes a huge responsibility. So, you know, we in 93, 94, as we were drawing up the South African Children's Rights Charter, we were talking about rights, and we were going into communities and into schools and into, I remember going to a college of education, and these teachers were really upset with us. And they were like, why do you want to give these children all these rights? You know, they're going to start bullying us, and it's going to be, and I said, well, with rights comes responsibility. So we're not just teaching them rights. I have a right to make a noise, but I have a responsibility to make sure that my noise is not affecting my family, my community, the people in my space. So we have to always try to get people to understand that. So I think what the guideline would be for parents and children, young people, whoever want to be in the media, as they call it, is what is your responsibility? Because it is your right. You can go wherever you wish, but your responsibility is to yourself, firstly, to your family, to your community, and to your sector. And how do we begin to say that? So a lot, I think quite a bit of that should be around training, and that children, if they are interested, should join clubs. They should join media clubs. You know, a lot of the schools are now beginning to do that. There's the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation that has a youth wing, which is fantastic, where they're doing quite a bit of training, but you're beginning to understand issues around rights, issues around democracy, issues around, because when you're on radio, what are you going to be talking about? How much do you have to read? You, for example, hosting the show, how much research did you have to do before the show happens? People don't understand that, the slog that comes worthily in the face. So we usually, when we do our training, our media training for producers, we say the number one most important thing is research. The number two most important thing is research. The number three most important thing is research, because only once you have the research done will everything else flow. You cannot have a cold conversation with me. You've had to research as I've had to prepare. And that is where the magic happens. Otherwise, we're just having a blah, blah conversation. And that is what parents need to understand, that I don't say don't put your child out there. I think, yes, your child might be the next big wig, producer, broadcaster, storyteller, inventor, but give them the tools that's going to ensure that that is what will happen, that they will become the best at what they want to do.
Absolutely. Ms. Bulbulia, thank you so much for the privilege of your time. You've given us lots to think about. One thought that you think everybody, when they think social media, broadcasting, what should be the one thing that comes to front of mind?
You need to know that everything is curated, is made up, and can therefore be fake. So have that in your mind before you just take it and believe it.
Good night, Ms. Bulbulia. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ray. It was an absolute pleasure.
Let's get real,